Welcome to the podcast of the University of Pennsylvania's Center for the Study of Contemporary China. I'm your host, Neysun Mahboubi, and in today's episode, you'll hear my conversation with the great Yasheng Huang, professor of global economics and management at MIT's Sloan School of Management, and a preeminent thinker about the dynamics of China's economic development in the reform and opening period. Professor Huang has famously argued in his important 2008 book, Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, Entrepreneurship and the State, that China's economic takeoff in the 1980s was rooted in the private entrepreneurship of rural township and village enterprises, and that China's later economic growth under a more state-led capitalism that is sometimes characterized as the China model has come at the expense of accumulating social and economic costs that eventually will have to be paid, perhaps in dramatic fashion. Even today, some 10 years after his book was published, its arguments remain fresh and continue to challenge a certain kind of conventional wisdom about the merits of heavy state intervention in the Chinese economy, which has only grown more robust since the 2008 financial crisis, and especially in the past 6 years under President Xi Jinping. Given those trends and the extent to which the structural features of Chinese state-led capitalism drive current economic tensions between China and other countries, the United States in particular, I was thrilled to have the opportunity to speak with Professor Huang for this podcast when he visited the University of Pennsylvania last April to participate in the center's annual conference on the theme of Reform and Opening, 40 Years and Counting. In our conversation, I invited Yasheng to restate and then revisit the core arguments of his book in light of later developments, at a time when the U.S.-China trade war was just heating up. As the episode goes live, now in April of 2019, we may be on the cusp of a sort of resolution of that trade war, which did in fact intensify. A resolution which by all accounts seems more likely to institutionalize economic tensions between China and the United States rather than to eliminate them, and yet does not appear poised to modify the primary components of Chinese state-led capitalism in any substantial ways. On a different podcast, you might find speculation as to why the U.S. government, under President Donald Trump, appears ready to accept a U.S.-China trade deal that features major Chinese purchasing commitments, but no real structural changes to how China approaches its economy. On this podcast, you will hear Professor Huang's careful and even-handed analysis of China's impressive economic gains over the past 40 years, the assorted costs and dangers he associates with a particular state-led approach that rose in prominence in the 1990s and is only growing more prevalent today, notwithstanding President Xi's recent comments in support of private entrepreneurship, as well as the hope that Yasheng placed, as a last resort, in the prospect that the U.S.-China trade war might provoke the structural economic reforms that you will hear him advocate. A hope that does not appear to have been realized in the time since we spoke. But whatever form the impending U.S.-China trade agreement ultimately takes, and whether or not China's slowing economy otherwise provokes a shift away from its current model, it will still be necessary to better understand and draw the right lessons from China's dramatic economic development. To that end, you'll be sure to want to listen closely and reflect upon the diagnosis you're about to hear from Professor Yasheng Huang. Professor Yasheng Huang, welcome to the University of Pennsylvania and to this podcast.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
So you've been here to participate in our center's big annual conference, this year on the theme of Reform and Opening, 40 Years and Counting, and your own presentation was on the topic of the reform of state-owned enterprises, which of course has been a central theme in your own work for many years.
That's right. It's a very important and interesting topic.
Your 2008 book, Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, Entrepreneurship and the State, is actually the definitive account of how private entrepreneurship, especially in rural areas, played a central role in China's economic miracle of the 1980s, and then of how the Chinese economy was redirected back towards a more state-led direction, favoring the urban areas in the 1990s and beyond.
Yes, that book is about the period from 78 to 2008. And the 2008, we had financial crisis, and the patterns, the issues I describe in the book became even more important after 2008 than before. And I'm working on a revision of my 2008 book to add discussions about the period since 2008.
Great. And so we'll be looking forward to the revised version. The book that was published in 2008 could be read as a critique, I think, of the so-called China model line of analysis. This idea that China has featured a unique model of state-led capitalism throughout the reform and opening period, and that this has been the main driver for the economic growth, which has brought millions of Chinese citizens out of poverty over the past 40 years. So I've taken that you're on record as voicing significant skepticism about the idea of there being a particular China model. You've even published this criticism in Chinese. For example, you have a 2011 article in Chinese. Chinese would be 中国模式, the China model. 到底, after all, 有多独特, has how much significance, let's say.
Yeah, so there are basically two kind of claims in the China model. One is about politics, the other is about economics. The one about politics states that China succeeded because it has this authoritarian system of the government. The leadership can do what they want to do. They don't have to go through the complicated democratic process of decision making. And that's why China succeeded in its economic development. The other claim, and this is more about economics, is that China figured out this very unique and special way of growing the economy, not relying so much on entrepreneurship, private sector development, but on the guided programs and actions of the government. So that model relies on the leadership capabilities and visions than the market economic model that we think typically explains economic growth in other countries. So my book, 2008 book, challenges both of these claims. Probably more attention in the book is paid to the economic side of the discussion rather than to the political side of the discussion. And I'll be happy to, in the podcast, to go into some kind of details where I construct my argument, I construct my evidence. So simply put, the way that people have this China model view of China is they compare China with countries such as India. They see China as being more authoritarian. They see China as having very strong government. And then they see China as having better economic growth. I have also worked on China-India comparisons, and I'll be happy to answer your question about that. But this is really a very wrong way of making that comparison. Essentially, they are sort of comparing apple and orange in that simple side-by-side comparison. I'll come back to the country-to-country comparison, but the right way to think about the China model is to look at within China, which regions are closer to China model, which regions are further away from China model, and then ask yourself the question, which of these two regions have done better economically speaking? It turns out systematically, the regions in China that are further from China model, right, political control, economic control, are the best performing regions in China. The regions that actually practice the China model are now mired in difficulties, high debt, and political instability, right? That actually is the right empirical basis to examine the veracity of China model and to also construct the what I believe to be the better explanation for why China has performed.
Right. And so I understand that in your critique of the China model, which you're quite well known for, there's these two dimensions. One is the dimension that suggests that if there was an economic miracle in China in the 1980s in particular, it was not because of state-led capitalism, but rather because of private entrepreneurship, which was sort of missed by many observers, especially Western observers, because they didn't fully understand the nature of these enterprises at the local level. But then
they didn't know anything about them.
But then there's a second component to your argument, which is that where you do see state-led capitalism in China, and particularly after the 1980s, becoming more robust feature of the Chinese economic story, that is not producing economic benefits in the way that it's sometimes associated with. So I understand your argument to have sort of those two components to it.
You're right about that, right? So let's pick a simple side-by-side, not side-by-side, but simple sort of apple-to-apple comparison as opposed to apple-to-orange comparison. Let's pick Shanghai and Shenzhen. And both of these cities have higher levels of economic development, high per capita GDP, and all of that. So superficially, there are similarities between the two cities. The difference is that Shanghai has had a long history of economic development, right, back to the 1920s and 1930s, and it was a bastion of Chinese indigenous capitalism in the 1920s, textile, machinery, and all of that. And then Shenzhen is relatively new, right? It grew on the basis of almost nothing, right? It was a fishing village in the late 1970s. Today, Shenzhen by far is a more innovative city as compared with Shanghai. It is a richer city as compared with Shanghai. It has more patents. It has more entrepreneurs. It has better technological achievements by far as compared with Shanghai. So Shanghai started out ahead. It is still rich today, but that's really because of a century of development. It's basically eating its own capital base. But in terms of the incremental value added in the last 40 years, it is so small as compared with Shenzhen. Now you ask yourself, of these two cities, which one is closer to a China model? Strong governments, strong SOEs, and strong economic control by the government. Which one is further away from China model? The answer is super clear. Shenzhen is further away from China model. Shenzhen developed in part because it got away from the central government. It was actually defying the central government on many, many issues. Shanghai was fed by the central government in the 1990s. There's no comparison in terms of Pudong region and Shenzhen. Pudong was a result of tax contributions by the rest of the country. There was a famous Chinese agricultural economist, mostly by the poor Chinese peasants, right, in the 1990s. The government then taxed the rural sector very, very high and then restricted their loan access and then used the money to build up Pudong. It was achieved at the expense of rural part of the country. Shenzhen, let's look at Shenzhen. It grew on its own dynamism. It grew on its own entrepreneurship. It created tens of millions of job opportunities for the rest of the country, including rural labor force. Now you tell me, which model is a better model? I think the answer is super clear.
Yeah.
It is the Shenzhen model, not the Shanghai model. I was going to quote a famous Chinese agricultural economist. He said, Pudong is the biggest theft of the Chinese countryside. And I agree 100% with him.
So I think it's clear that both normatively, you believe that China model is problematic, but also descriptively, you think that where there has been economic growth and impressive development in China, it's not been associated with the China model. But all of that said, I think that even your 2008 book, and also especially your later writing, does very much recognize that there's been a resurgence of state-led capitalism and the greater entrenchment of state-owned enterprises, we'll call them SOEs, since that early period of 1980s economic growth. And I think it's probably fair to say that, especially after the publication of your book, given the developments in China in the period after the financial crisis in 2008 and going forward, you've become very concerned about the ever greater state intrusion in the Chinese economy.
I'm very concerned, and I do not automatically celebrate the fast GDP growth that has been produced since 2008. I said automatically for a purpose, right? So obviously there are some performances that are good, and we need to distinguish the performance due to efficiency, technology, entrepreneurship, and the performance due to piling up debt. Essentially, state capitalism, the way that state capitalism has been growing the Chinese economy is through high level of bank debt. The Chinese debt to GDP ratio is so high, and the returns are low. The banking system is going to be stuck with this time bomb of non-performing loans. And so this is the problem that I have with state capitalism. I don't deny the ability of state capitalism to deliver GDP growth. What I do argue with is the efficiency with which the state capitalism delivers GDP growth. It delivers GDP growth at a low level of efficiency as compared with whatever you can call it, more entrepreneurial capitalism, more grassroots capitalism, more arm's length capitalism, as compared with that model of growth, which was the growth model that China adopted in the 1980s. So I'm not going to say that since the 1990, everything has been a disaster. Clearly it is not, right? So the living standard is improving, and Chinese economy is getting stronger, and all of that. So there are good things that have happened. And to the extent that there are good things that have happened, they are also due to sort of government being more liberal, right? So I would count globalization as a big boost to Chinese growth in the 1990s and since WTO. Now there are some, restrictions now, and I worry about that, right? So the way I see it in the last sort of 40 years, the way I see it is in the first 10 years, it's basically kind of grassroots entrepreneurial growth that has delivered the best growth ever in the last 40 years. In the second 10-year period, the entrepreneurial capitalism was curbed, mainly in the countryside. But, in the urban area, they undertook reforms and SOE privatization, globalization, right? So all the bad things that came with the rural restrictions of rural entrepreneurship are somewhat offset by these other developments. So essentially, sort of a kind of on the net or on the margin, you do have this stronger development of state capitalism, but it's not like fully fledged state capitalism. The third 10-year, right, during the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao period, is kind of a muddling through, right? It doesn't really have a strong push in one direction or the other. Kind of continue with lots of things that happened in the 1990s with a stronger social support system, which I think has done some good for the country. But then they began to restrict the globalization part of the picture. And then the sort of the last kind of 10 years or 5 years, we have a very strong leader, Xi Jinping, and all the evidence suggests that he is a very, very strong leader, very, very strong politically. On the economic front, I don't see him as going away from state capitalism. I think he's going to move forward with state capitalism, maybe even stronger than before, right? So that's my prediction. And I think that is China going to end up in a disaster? I don't know, but I'm not going to rule it out. And looking at the debt
And you've suggested in your work that the nature of the Chinese economy is particularly vulnerable to some kind of shocks that could lead to some sort of disaster.
Well, I think now we are talking about the Trump shock, right? So the trade war. I think it is happening at a very inconvenient moment in history. If you look at the past 10 years and how China is able to sustain this rapid GDP growth, it's mostly through massive investments. And I think everybody recognizes that the investment spree is very dangerous to the economy. High debt, and there are bridges to nowhere, repeat investments, low productivity, low efficiency. In the past, when that happened in the 1990s, for example, the country had one recourse, which was to export. Essentially, it was able to export its way out of state capitalism, right? When you export to the United States, it is all driven by private sector. It's driven by those little guys in Shenzhen and Guangdong, not by the SOEs in Shanghai. So to some extent, the problems of the state capitalism are being masked by the delivery and the superb performance of foreign invested enterprises in Guangdong, domestic private enterprises in Guangdong, through mostly an export strategy. So now China is nearing the end of this investment binge. Debt is very, very high. Returns are very, very low. It cannot go back to this export rescue as it was able to do because of the Trump shock, the trade war between China and the United States, right? Maybe there's a resolution, maybe there's not. But if you look at the total trade as a percentage share of the GDP, it has been declining. So even if in the best case scenario, I don't think trade is going to come as a safe harbor for Chinese economy. Now what do you do? I think in the past, I would say in the 1980s, it was really the strategy that got them out of the central planning, the kind of more entrepreneurial, rural dynamism, right? In the 1990s, it was a combination of good policies opening up to the outside world, and 1990s and early 2000s, and the WTO, right? So we should also remember during this period, the Western economies were growing also very fast, right? Before the financial crisis in 2008. So the debt-fueled growth in the West essentially increased the demand for imports from the rest of the world, and China became a very important part of that supply chain, right? So essentially it kind of worked out by a combination of right policies, luck, the Western growth, which offset against some of these downside of the state capitalism. And then you had the real estate boom, right? Beginning in early 2000s, lasting to now, maybe for another 10 years. That kind of also papered over the state capitalism because you have this incredible boom that just happened. And that boom both raised the investment demand, investment supply, as well as reduced superficially the need to use exports and globalization to get out of your problem. I think the best case scenario for the Chinese leaders going forward is technology. So the real estate boom is history. Done that, get over it. It leaves piles of debt here and there, right? It's going to have a headwind against the GDP growth. I think their hope is, okay, so real estate is done. Let's see if there's another magic bullet that's going to pull us out, right?
And of course, technology and innovation have been very much emphasized.
That's right.
By Xi Jinping. Well, I think what we've done so far is we've basically telegraphed for our listeners the scope of this conversation we're about to get into in even more detail. And I'm really looking forward to it. This is going to be really fun to go through this material with you. And just to kind of set the framing for the listeners for the next hour and a half or so of our conversation. So we're going to be playing with this concept of the China model, which is somewhat ironic because you are very much on record as voicing skepticism about the China model for all the reasons we discussed earlier. But still, it's maybe even just as a shorthand for state capitalism on the economic side. Maybe it's a concept we can play around with. And so the goal of our discussion is going to be to assess where your own thinking lies about this idea of state capitalism, or we could even call it the China model, and to gauge what you think is the remaining room for private enterprise at the moment, and how this story is playing out, not just internally within China, but as you just telegraphed, in terms of exporting abroad, and the relationship with the U.S. So why don't we just sort of start with an initial building block and make sure that our listeners really understand this concept of state-led capitalism and this rubric of a China model. And again, you initially distinguished between the economic dimensions of this terminology and the political dimensions. I guess Daniel Bell is particularly well known for not just articulating, but even making a normative claim on behalf of the political dimensions of the China model. We're going to kind of keep away to the extent that we can. Of course, you can never fully distinguish economics and politics in China, but we're going to stay away from the political side and more looking at the economic side. Maybe you could just sort of summarize for the listeners, what are the main features of the China economic model, or we could also call it state-led capitalism, that you think are distinctive and important for people to understand?
Actually, descriptively speaking, right? So you quoted me as having an article in Chinese, how unique is China model. So in that piece, I laid out two arguments. One is the Chinese growth performance is actually not that unique, meaning that we can apply conventional economic tools and concepts to understand that growth if we get the facts right? So in my 2008 book, I spent pages and pages going through getting the facts right, including some really nitty-gritty technical issues such as what is the definition of township and village enterprise, right? So, I mean, I spent pages over seemingly little thing, but actually they have really, really big meaning, because depending on how you understand them, you draw very, very different conclusions. So that's one. And the other is that to the extent that China model has the following features: the state-owned banking system, industrial policy push, state-private sector collaboration, right, and strong political control. We saw all of that in other developing countries in the 60s and 70s and 1980s. We also saw that some of those countries were able to grow under this model, actually for 30 years and 20, 40 years. And then two things happened to them. One was they collapsed. China is still going, so I gave credit to China. They collapsed. Or in the case of Taiwan, South Korea, they transitioned themselves out of it, right, and became more free market driven economic systems, right? So essentially what I'm trying to say is that it's not a stable system, and we have seen it before. So,
well, let me just ask you on that point, on the historical, and again, just in this descriptive part of trying to capture what is the features of state-led capitalism in China. Is there any particular Chinese spin, or is there any way that we could claim that there's a state capitalism with Chinese characteristics, or is it really almost entirely the same as what they had in South Korea or in Taiwan or some other developing countries before they transitioned to more market-based systems?
I don't see any sort of a kind of unique Chinese spin, but I do see the state capitalist model in China as a bit more state capitalistic than other models, right? So let's take the ownership as an example. In the past, developing countries practiced state capitalism mostly on the basis of private sector enterprises, private sector model. They didn't have this level of state ownership. Maybe the banks were state-owned, everything else was kind of private. And maybe the steel industry was state-owned, but other things were private. So China, you can argue, has a more extreme version of state capitalism, right? More state ownership as compared with those economies. And politically, it definitely is more authoritarian than...
Right, we could maybe even mention that the party explicitly is
so one-party system,
being...
so if you look at South Korea, right, so yes, it was authoritarian, even military dictatorship, but they had, kind of pseudo-elections, and they had strikes by the Korean workers, they had some unions, and they have students, and so it wasn't as tightly controlled as the Chinese system. But I don't feel comfortable attaching that to Chinese sort of culture or spin. So it's just that they have a more extreme version of it, right? So we can kind of array these systems. And I also want to make a fundamental and philosophical point, right? When we think about economic systems, the right way to think about them is not to say there are only two kinds of economic systems, socialism and capitalism. It's really a spectrum of the systems. They are sort of positioned on that spectrum in different places.
State-led capitalism is already a point between those two.
It's already, right? So China, definitely today, I wouldn't say China is a communist country. It has deviated substantially from that. I think everybody will agree it's not a laissez-faire capitalism either, right? So, and then India, South Korea in the 1970s, Brazil in the 1970s, they are probably a little bit more to the left of the Chinese system. If you put the extreme side as laissez-faire capitalism, maybe a little bit closer than China today. Politically, right? So they had authoritarian system as opposed to a totalitarian system, right? So all these things suggest that China had sort of a stronger version of state capitalism, better and more capable bureaucracy, more organized capacity, right? So I would argue that not everything is bleak and dark with Chinese state capitalism. And to the extent that you have capable bureaucracy able to provide basic services, right? That's a plus from an economic perspective, right? So if you look at China and India, so I'm kind of a little bit going back to the earlier discussion. If you want to make China-India comparison, apple-to-apple comparison, orange-to-orange comparison, what you want to do is to control for other differences between the two countries. And the basic thing you need to control for is the quality and the quantity of human capital. And I would argue unambiguously that China has done 1,000 times better job as compared with India in terms of human capital development, right? Public health, public education, even during the Cultural Revolution period. It's actually even going before that. So historically speaking, in part because of the exam system, and the Chinese system has always had very strong tradition of literacy, being able to read and write, mass literacy. There is some evidence to suggest that Chinese mass literacy in the 18th century, 17th century was kind of comparable to that in Britain, right? So this is going way back, right? Sure. So I do see that as a huge strength, right? So whether you say this is part of the state capitalism or not, we can have a discussion. I don't automatically say, this is a part of state capitalism. China in 17th century, is that state capitalism or something else, right? There's just this long tradition of respect state for scholarship, right? Respect for writing, right? That India never really had. So a lot of the growth differences between India and China are really explained by that in favor of China. So there's kind of a fundamental attribution error that many people committed, which is they look at the differences between China and India. They say one is democracy, the other is authoritarian system. oh, one has better GDP growth, the other has worse. And then they say, oh, it's authoritarian system. Little do they know that there are other differences, right? Maybe it's these other differences that explain the growth differences between China and India. I would say human capital really probably does 80% of the explanation, right? And there are some other things that may explain the rest, right? So then we really need to take that more seriously, right? So China always has something behind its back toward good, solid economic performance. Even in the 16th century, 17th century, they had pretty good economic performance by the standard prevailing at that time, right? And then if you look at the...
And is your claim that the state was involved in that story?
So there, I'm not in that sense, I'm not a, free market fundamentalist evangelical, right? I'm not. I see state as being absolutely critical in building the human capital base, right? And this is what the Chinese did historically, and also what the Chinese did during the communist period, and also what the Chinese state is doing today. That I gave them A+, right? So I celebrate their achievements.
And we were talking earlier, I feel like it's okay to share with the listeners that this is an area that you're working on now for potentially a future book. And so this is something to maybe look forward to down the line to see how your thinking on this subject develops and how you articulate it in the book.
Yeah, so I'm working on a book going back to history of China. And it is an effort to understand the historical foundation of many of the things that we observe in China today. And I have to say, before I undertook this project, there are lots of things I kind of have thought about, but don't really have a feel for their answers, right? One of the things I have been thinking about, what is it about Chinese bureaucracy and Chinese people who are capable, right? So capable, I don't mean to do calculus kind of capability, although there's a lot of that in China too. But capable in the sense that you pay attention to details, you pay attention to patterns, think about how those things are important in manufacturing, right? And you want to produce thousands and 10,000s of those products to repeat one after the other, to replicate one after the other. That's actually a very important discipline to have to create manufacturing miracle. And so my current book is about how this mentality, right, the Chinese mental model, paying attention to details, paying attention to patterns, emphasizing replication, that was laid down, 1,500 years ago. And since then, through a very elaborate civil service examination system, right? So how that has imprinted the Chinese manufacturing success today, right? So to some extent, it is my effort to explain the Chinese performance in the context of current policies, globalization, and history, right? So in the end, we look at one number, or maybe a set of numbers, right? GDP growth and improvement of living standards. But lots of things go into that, right? And, it could be 3 or 4 things. It could be tens of those things that together produce the GDP growth. So it's not right to just pin everything on one thing, right? So this is what I have against people who take a simple look at China and India and then draw a quick conclusion about why China has performed and India has not.
Well, so to synthesize my understanding of your sort of position on state-led capitalism up to this point of the discussion. So one point that I think you've clearly articulated is that you're not intrinsically opposed to the notion of state involvement in the economy.
Not at all.
And that you see that there are some benefits from that. You don't necessarily think that state-led capitalism in China has been incredibly unique in this period.
That's right.
Both maybe historically speaking vis-a-vis previous periods in China, but especially horizontally vis-a-vis other countries that are associated with state-led capitalism. Although you do think that many scholars missed the role of private entrepreneurship in that 1980s period where you really had this economic liftoff in China. How would you characterize the way that the Chinese state-led capitalism under the Communist Party after 1978, how that evolved from the period of the 1990s and then the 2000s after you start to move back towards state-led capitalism that was maybe somewhat, as you made the claim in the book, was somewhat being moved away from in the 1980s? How would you describe the way that it evolves in the 1990s and 2000s?
The critical turning point in the 1990s was coming together a new regime in Beijing that comprised almost exclusively of bureaucrats from Shanghai.
So associated with Jiang Zemin,
Zhu Rongji, and then if you look at their lieutenants, especially on the economic side, it's almost 100% Shanghainese. So I have nothing intrinsically against Shanghai, even though I'm from Beijing.
It's a nice city, Shanghai's. Some nice neighborhoods.
In its own ways. And
that sounded a little bit more pointed.
There's that. So I think Shanghai schooled China twice. Gang of Four was from Shanghai, and they schooled China during the Cultural Revolution. And then another group of Shanghainese did another thing in the 1990s and basically decimated the countryside. So many people don't know this or don't remember. Leading up to the WTO, late 1990s, rural China was in crisis. For 10 years, the household income growth in rural part of the country was completely stagnant. So we're talking about GDP growth, almost 10%, 9%, something like that. But the rural Chinese, their income, I'm not talking about rural GDP, but their income, household income. The only growth of the rural household income was from deflation. Essentially, the prices were coming down. In China, in the 1990s, there was a deflation, in part because of collapse of demand. And almost like a Japan scenario. Many people don't know that. And the reason that happened was the central government completely squeezed out the rural entrepreneurs out of the credit markets, starved them the credits that they needed to grow. And many of the rural enterprises that were developing very fast in the 1980s went into bankruptcies. The rural financial institutions became insolvent. There was a term in the early 2000s. It's called the three agricultural crises. The crisis of the countryside, the crisis of the peasants, the crisis of agriculture. It was very severe, a post-political threat to the regime, political unrest. A lot of it happened in the rural area. Many people just went to Shanghai, went to Beijing, they see these skyscrapers, and then they declare China to be an economic success. They don't visit countryside, they don't look at the survey data. Many China scholars don't give Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao a lot of credit. They were slow to reform and all of that. I agree with much of that. I gave them credit for one thing, for doing one thing. They reversed the rural decline. They reduced the taxes. They supported education, supported public health. They did a reverse transfer from the urban to the rural through mostly government policies rather than through entrepreneurship and that. That actually positioned China on relatively solid basis for the 2008 financial crisis.
So Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao come into power around 2002.
2002.
So the rural crisis that you've been describing, I guess, is late 90s.
Late 90s,
is at its height.
One of the most famous books in the early 2000s, written by a Chinese journalist, was about the three rural crises. Wen Jiabao read it, Hu Jintao read it, and the story is Wen Jiabao cried when he read it. It has incredible details about how the urban bureaucrats, the central government, essentially robbed the countryside clean and drove a lot of these promising entrepreneurs to the ground. They arrested rural entrepreneurs who...
What was the thinking that was underlying this move against the rural entrepreneurs? Was there a theory of, because the economic gains of the 1980s were clear, what was the thinking that led to almost eliminating that source of economic dynamism?
So let me try to construct their thinking, because the thinking has never been, as far as I know, clearly, explicitly expressed. I think it's several things. One is just urban bias. It's a familiar idea in developing countries, urban bias. People tend to associate urban development as modernity, rural, low-tech, to be discriminated against. So that's one idea. The other idea is globalization, right? Because foreign firms tend not to go to the countryside. They go to urban areas. To attract foreign firms, you need to make the urban space prettier. This is why they spend so much money on Shanghai, right? This is kind of a Li Guangyu's strategy, basically. In the 1960s, he planted nice trees and nice gardens, and then the foreigners showed up, oh, wow, this is nice. I can stay here for 20 years and let me stay, right? So
Li Guangyu, of course, the
Singapore, right? The prime minister, founding prime minister of Singapore. That he was explicit about that, right? So Singapore in the 1960s was a mosquito-infested place and swamps, and really not a garden city that we know of today. Let's just make sure we have golf course and, we have nice gardens and clean, So he launched campaigns against spitting and smoking and chewing gum. Chinese elites in the 1990s were heavily influenced by that model of economic growth. For Singapore, I think Li Guangyu was great and he did the right thing. For China, it was a disaster. The reason that doing the same thing is good in one country but a disaster in the other is Li Guangyu was absolutely right, because if he didn't do those things, Singapore would not be on the map, right? It's a small country, 3 million people, whatever, right? In a sort of a contested area, Malaysia, Just think about General Motors executive in 1965, or GE executive in 1965. Those people are not going to wake up in the morning and say, oh, I got to go to Singapore, right? So you really need to do these things to attract the attention from the multinational corporations. China, even if the country is swimming in spit, swimming in dirt, as long as your economy is growing, the multinational companies are going to go there. Look at India. So I don't know if you have visited India, so a lot of people have, I have, right? So it's not as pleasant as visiting China. It's hot, humid, and, quite poor and infectious diseases and all of that. When you were growing at 1%, nobody gave a damn to you. Now you're growing 6-7%, you're able to do this for 5-6 years, or maybe even 10 years. Even if you don't change your look, right? It's still kind of dirty and all of that. They're going to come. Today, India is attracting a lot of FDI, right? $40 billion, $50 billion, $60 billion of FDI, right? Without doing the Singapore thing, right? Using rural residents' money to build a garden city in Shanghai. They didn't do that, right? So my point is that for China, as long as you have economic growth, because you're big, 1.3, 1.4 billion people, you don't need to do these pretty things, right? And there's an old saying, the daughter of emperor doesn't need to worry about finding a husband. China is not like that. Brazil is like that. Russia is like that. If they get their economic house in order, you don't have to dress up pretty. You get foreign direct investments.
Well, in this alternate scenario where you didn't have this move away from rural enterprise in the 1990s, how far could that have taken China? What kind of economic future would you have foreseen if you continued to empower rural enterprise in the way they had in the 1990s going forward beyond that?
Very easy, right? Very easy to illustrate. China constricted the growth of rural entrepreneurship everywhere except in one province, and that's Zhejiang.
That's interesting.
Except Zhejiang and Wenzhou. Now Zhejiang is a powerhouse of economic growth. It was ranked in the middle of the country in terms of the GDP per capita in the late 1970s. Now it is either the third or the fourth from the top, right? Sort of below Shanghai and Beijing. And to some extent, it is an apple-orange comparison because Shanghai and Beijing are cities. They are not provinces. As cities, they don't have a large rural population. Usually in developing countries, it's the size of rural population that drags down the per capita GDP, right? So Zhejiang rising from the middle of the pack now to the very top in terms of province. And then you look at another province, Jiangsu, which had similar rural dynamism in the 1980s as compared with Zhejiang. Historically speaking, I wrote a paper about this 10 years ago. The story of two provinces. So Jiangsu had very similar development history as Zhejiang, right, in the 1920s and 30s. So history is about the same. Geography is about the same. They are all coastal. One sort of above Shanghai, the other is below Shanghai. Except for this, right? Zhejiang actually restricted rural finance and Wenzhou didn't. So Zhejiang still grew. So I'm not saying that, it was negative GDP. No, it was actually very impressive GDP growth, except for a number of things. One is today in Zhejiang, high debt. The number of the city governments in Zhejiang now, they're basically insolvent. The other is that...
Well, that's not a good...
It's not a good sign. It's not a good sign. Whereas in Zhejiang, you don't have that.
Oh, you said Zhejiang, you meant Jiangsu.
Jiangsu, sorry. In
Jiangsu, you have the high debt.
You have high debt, right? So that's one. And the other is that in Jiangsu, the GDP growth is about comparable to Zhejiang, but the household income growth, which is one measure I actually care about. I don't care about GDP growth. I care about the take-home pay for the Chinese masses, right? So just you and me, right? Do you really care about US GDP growth?
Right.
As opposed to salary that UPenn pays you, as opposed the MIT salary that I get from MIT, right? I mean, maybe I care about GDP growth, maybe intellectually, but in terms of enriching my life, it's really the MIT's pay, right? On that measure, Zhejiang beats out Jiangsu by a mile. And then look at entrepreneurship, technology development. Zhejiang today has more patents than Jiangsu. Zhejiang today has Alibaba, has Wanxiang, has Wahaha, these strong domestic private sector companies that Jiangsu doesn't have even one.
And would it seem, because when we've been talking about rural enterprises and the support for private entrepreneurship in these town and village enterprises that are located in the rural areas, what's the line that connects that type of enterprise to Alibaba?
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
How do you get from one type of thing, which when you just say rural enterprise, you could even maybe explain what a typical rural enterprise would be. In my mind, it's like, maybe some factory to produce shoelaces, something like that. So
there are multiple linkages, some direct, some less direct. One of the biggest investors, manufacturing investors in China, in the United States from China, is Wanxiang Automotive. It was a rural enterprise in Zhejiang province. Today it has 20 factories or even more in the United States. Global operation integrates the supply chain in the United States with the supply chain in China, runs a significant R&D center. They are going into electric car and all of that. Started out as a humble rural enterprise. The classic difference between how a bureaucrat looks at a rural enterprise And how a scholar like me looking at rural enterprise is the following. I have an evolutionary view. He or she, the bureaucrat, has a static view. They look at the rural enterprise. So this Wanxiang, they produce the rain, what do you call it on the car? The
windshield wipers.
Windshield wipers. That's how they started. For me, obviously not all of them evolved to be big global companies from windshield wipers, right? But some of them may evolve to be like that. Whereas for an industrial policy bureaucrat, he or she looks at this and says, low tech. So there's another company, state-owned, that is producing engines. I only have 1 million yuan of bank loans. Why should I give that 1 million yuan of bank loans to the windshield swiper?
Oh, that's interesting.
Right? So I should give it to that enterprise, right? By doing that, you're depriving the rural enterprise of the possibility of technology deepening, product upgrading, and globalization, right? So if we think about these things dynamically, right, which is the way I tend to think about things, right? I respect the rural entrepreneurs' capabilities, their insight, their vision, right? Yes, today they are producing
whatever they
low-tech
particularly started, those qualities will drive them forward.
They have to go forward because there's going to be another little Wanxiang coming in, eating at their heels, right? So then you have to move forward, right? So if you don't move forward, you're going to be dead, right? So I have this competitive evolutionary view of economic world, whereas the bureaucrat has this very static view of the world. So think about that, the impact of that decision, right? He's going to destroy two enterprises in that decision. One is that he's going to depriving the dynamic enterprise access to credit. So the dynamic enterprise dies. He's going to make the static enterprise more static. The static enterprise, so easy to get credits. What incentive do I have to improve the quality of the product, the technology of my operations? Because I have special connections with the government, I just get the money, right? So the very act of competition is going to make sure that the first enterprise is going to develop technology, and the second enterprise is going to catch up, right? By this bureaucrat standing in the middle, he's going to destroy them both. This is precisely what happened in Jiangsu. A lot of the promising enterprises who are not as dynamic as the enterprises in Zhejiang, but they were kind of, sort of collective enterprise. They were okay. They got easy credit. They got spoiled, and they don't need to compete, right? They also die. So that's one linkage, right? So in Zhejiang, it's just more competitive. The private providers of the capital hold you accountable, right? You have to return the loans, and you have to pay me back, and all of that. So that's a direct linkage of a company like Wanxiang starting out as a rural enterprise, today is operating as a global company. The Alibaba story is interesting. There, the linkage is less direct because Alibaba is not a rural enterprise. It started out by Ma Yun, an English teacher.
Jack Ma,
and it is in the city. But here's the linkage. Many people don't know this. Jack Ma, when he started Alibaba, the first place he wanted to go was Shanghai. He went to Shanghai. And Shanghai looked at this, what's internet? What is this? That was like 1996 or something like that. You're not a big company. This is strange thing that you are proposing. Get lost. And he got lost. He set up his operation in Hangzhou, in Zhejiang. Zhejiang had a more laissez-faire attitude, right? They don't really make a distinction between a big enterprise and small enterprise. They say, okay, so we don't know what you're doing, but why should I care, right? So you are an enterprise and get it, set it up, right? That's the linkage. So the more laissez-faire, the policy culture, right? Whereas the control culture in Shanghai means that they tend to be, I'm not saying that Shanghai bureaucrats were anti-economic growth. They're actually extremely supportive of economic growth, except through all the wrong mechanisms, right? They think it's the big enterprise that is going to bring technology and growth. Look at the enterprises that Shanghai courted. General Motors, one of the worst companies in the whole world, right? The gasoline Buick model, poor emission standards. Look at Santana, a horrible car, right? With a pollution and terrible mileage. Yeah, but because it's a Volkswagen, it's a company I heard of. It's GM is one of the biggest companies in the world. I like them, right? So this is a typical Shanghai bureaucrat attitude toward economic growth. They gave policy concessions worth billions of dollars to GM and Volkswagen, right? Volkswagen, a terrible car. The Santana model was about to be illegal in Europe because Europe was moving toward a higher environmental standard. Santana production line would be illegal under the European.
This is roughly what period of time?
This is roughly sort of early 1980s, right? Europe was tightening its environmental emission standards. Santana will be illegal under that. China said, oh, let's have it, right? So because they heard of Volkswagen, big name company, and GM, right? Buick and Volkswagen Santana had a very good run in China because these are terrible cars and they made billions of dollars from the Chinese market, costing the opportunity for China to directly leapfrog to the next stage of automobile development, electric car. And now China is trying to catch up, right? But they went for that. They went for these deadbeats. This is kind of the fundamental difference. And the other difference between Zhejiang model and Jiangsu model and Shanghai model and Wenzhou model is because you favor big firms. So who are the big firms in the 1990s? They're foreign firms. So what they did was they carved out monopolies to the foreign firms. Because at that time, foreign firms were not as willing to come to China as they are today. China was, Cultural Revolution and all of that. So then what do? They say, okay, come in. I gave all the market to you, right? You have 50% joint venture, but I gave all the market to you. This is what Santana had. When China signed up with a GM deal with the Buick, China promised not to set up another joint venture for another 5 years, essentially giving the rapid developing market to one or two companies. This is all at the cost of the Chinese households, the cost to the Chinese taxpayers, and transferring the money from the poor Chinese households to GM, to Shanghai automobile industry. So it's a terrible model. You get GDP growth, right? Because immediately you are beginning to produce cars, and superficially you're upgrading technology because you're producing more value-added products. But the actual benefits to the Chinese are actually minimal.
And I think that's an interesting theme that I've noticed runs through a lot of your work, which is to not lose sight of what's happening for individuals in the country as opposed to just looking at this larger number of GDP growth. So the unfortunate fact is that the bureaucratic approach that you're associating with Shanghai did become the prevalent approach in the country in the 90s onward. It's nice that Zhejiang got something of a carve-out. Yeah. But otherwise, your point is that the bureaucratic approach becomes prevalent in the 1990s, sparks a lot of problems that we can talk about, but also the shift away from private enterprise in rural areas helps to exacerbate a crisis in rural areas. And going back to our earlier discussion, you suggested that Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, when they come into power, they're made aware of the crisis in the rural areas, and they then begin to pursue some policies like tax reform and other kinds of alleviation programs to lessen the burden on the rural sector. But did Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao change the overall approach to capitalism by reigniting the scope for private enterprise, or was the model of state-led capitalism entrenched at that point?
They didn't. So the way I describe Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao period is almost like an emergency room type of operation, right? So essentially you have a sick patient, you resuscitate the patient. Once the patient is resuscitated and has recovered from the emergency situation, you go back to the old way, right? So that's kind of a way. So I genuinely believe that Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao have done good to China and especially to the rural sector. I would say that they didn't take on the fundamentals of the development model. They, to some extent, they made it worse even, right? So the big enterprise development, the SOE development, a lot of that happened under their watch. The real estate boom, right? So we talk about 4 phases of Chinese growth drivers, right? First period, grassroots entrepreneurship growth. Second, the globalization. Third, real estate boom. So the real estate boom happened suddenly, and it produced probably an unprecedented level of wealth accumulation, not in the hands of the ordinary Chinese, by the way, but in the hands of bureaucrats and crony capitalists.
And I should underscore, that's another phrase that you're particularly associated with, is describing in terms of crony capitalism in this period going forward.
The real estate has a lot of those guys. The way that I view state capitalism and crony capitalism is that they are almost like twins, right? Or two sides of the same coin. The state capitalism is really the state using the private sector to achieve their end. Crony capitalism is capitalists using the state to achieve their end, right? So that's the way that I describe the similarities and differences between these two. Crony capitalism developed massively under Hu and Wen. Corruption worsened significantly during this period, accompanied by wealth creation through releasing the value of the land, right? And the state benefited through land sales and property development, right? So the state was happy. Crony capitalists were happy. Peasants were kind of happy because part of the windfall from the real estate was transferred to the peasants. So you got a situation where everybody was happy with the status quo. When everybody was happy, there's no incentive to change, right? So, okay, I do a little bit more on the social side, but hey, I have all these real estate value to be unleashed. Why should I think about private sector development? Why should I think about the inefficiencies of the SOEs? There's really no pressure. So essentially you stay with those things and also think about other things that they have done, right? So using this massive amount of money to build new universities, so there are probably two good things that they have done with the money, right? So even though it has created crony capitalism and corruption, but the happy thing is that not every single penny has gone to the corrupt official. There are also resources being poured to the peasants and being poured to the education. So which is a good.
And that's the alleviation program.
That's the alleviation program. They waive the taxes on the rural sector. They boosted significantly the public health. So if you look at the public health coverage during the Mao period, we can argue about the quality of rural healthcare, but still a lot of people were covered. In the 80s, as the initial move away from socialism, a lot of these collective health schemes collapsed. But the leadership, I know this for sure because I was working in the World Bank and doing research to provide advice to the Chinese policymakers to repair the rural health system and pensions and all of that. They were thinking far ahead in the 1980s to reestablish that system, and then they got booted out. So that's what happened to them. And then it was not built, let to die. In 2004, when I was traveling in one part of Guangdong that had a lot of rural migrant workers, I saw a sign on the wall next to the street. It says that if you were born between 1990 and 1999, come to the clinic to receive immunization shots against measles and those things, right? I don't know if you have children. If you have children, you know that typically you receive those shots when your children are 3 years old and 4 years old, right? So basically by year 4, you are done with these shots. In the 1990s, the Chinese government began to charge the rural residents for receiving immunization shots. As a result, millions of the Chinese rural residents born in the 1990s didn't get the shots. Hu and Wen recognized this. They allocated money and fund specifically to support administration of immunization shots when these people are already 16 years old or something like that, 14 years old, right? So I'm just giving you a graphic illustration of the deprivation that happened in Chinese countryside in the 1990s.
And the alleviation program that Hu and Wen pursued is a real
It's a real
program,
thing. It's a
even
real
if
thing.
they're not fundamentally shifting the direction of the economy.
No, I think it was a real thing. I also think that in those things, the state should play an active, even intrusive role in the development, right? So,
that's interesting. That the alleviation program is actually itself a form of state intervention.
It is,
and that's
it is.
You're not, I don't know, a committed Adam Smith style. Even if that's not a fair way of characterizing Adam Smith, but in any case, you're not so anti-state involvement in social and economic life that you'd be opposed to the state being active in pursuing an alleviation program of this nature.
In my opinion, free market fundamentalists are lunatics, right? Look at the debate over Obamacare in this country.
Sure, yeah.
The Republicans, I think they're lunatics. They are against the Obamacare for the requirement of individual mandate and for the penalty and all of that. I think this is lunatic. So it's interesting because I do engage in the social media in China, not so much in this country, but in China. So in this country, I'm a left to the center, democratic leaning person, intellectual. In China, I'm viewed as an ultra right-wing person, right? So I think maybe both perspectives are correct because in China, it's so much sort of to the other side, right? So I applaud Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao's poverty alleviation programs and some of the low-cost housing program that they built for the urban residents. There are a lot of Chinese economists who say, "Oh, this is bad. This is a bad thing to do because it is encouraging welfare and all of that." I said, "This is ridiculous, right?" So think about the alternative. If they don't build these low-cost housing programs for the poor people, then they're going to use the money to benefit corrupt officials. Given that alternative, even if the low-cost housing units in China are not being occupied by truly, truly poor people, it is still a social plus, right? So that's the way I reason myself out from the kind of intuitive, instinctual free marketeering ideology. But also it allows me to be critical of a government that restricts private sector development. So I don't really see any contradiction between state playing a very strong, direct. I can be supportive of the SOEs. Let me give you one scenario where I think SOEs make sense. The scenario is this. As a transitional measure, when the country doesn't have a well-functioning pension program, unemployment benefit program, you should support SOEs as a transitional program. But there's a fundamental difference between supporting SOEs as a transitional program and supporting SOEs as a permanent economic development program. I have no hope of the SOEs as a future competitive enterprises emerging out of China. But in the short run, if you lay off workers without a good safety net, maybe we should keep them open. We should keep them running, right? So in that sense, I'm ideologically flexible. And what I care about is the practical effects of what you do. It's not how pure your ideology is. So in my current revision of the book, I gave a lot of applause to what Hu and Wen have done. And by the way, this is not a conventional view. Most of the scholars, even in China, are really negative on Hu and Wen. I am, as a whole, also negative, right? So if you look at corruption, if you like crony capitalism and all of that. But on the other hand, my argument is put any conventional Chinese leader in their position, they will do the crony capitalism part,
but not necessarily
without doing the other part. Right? So between that, I actually think Hu and Wen did a good job.
But the crony capitalism part they did do. Whether or not
they did
other leaders would have not done it, I take your point that other leaders would have done
I think,
but they certainly didn't move the direction of the...
They encouraged it. They allowed it. They encouraged it. And I would say that Hu Yaobang would not allow it. Hu Yaobang would confront the problem. Zhao Ziyang would confront the problem. Basically, the leaders in the 1980s would confront the problem much early on. So if I were given the choice between the leaders in 1990s and the actual leaders in the 2000s, Hu and Wen, I don't think they differ much on the crony capitalism part. But they would differ on the rural alleviation part. Then, by and large, I'm more supportive of Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao. If I were given a choice between Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang and Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao, the choice is clear. I always go for Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang. No, there's no context. I believe that they are, plus Deng Xiaoping, I believe they are the best leaders ever in the modern Chinese history.
And whatever the nature of crony capitalism in 2007, 2008, around the midpoint of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao's tenure, I would think it's multiplied by many factors once you have the global financial crisis and then the Chinese response to the global financial crisis, which one could say brings China through that period by some measures more successfully than other countries. I think China is the only country of, sort of if you compare it to the United States, if you compare it to other major Western democracies, China continues to have GDP growth through the years of the global financial crisis. And that's because they basically, as I understood it, they took that model, the state-led model and the increasingly crony capitalistic model, and just put it on steroids, injected even more money into that system along the lines that had been sketched out.
So let me say two things. So I guess I agree with you maybe 50%, right? So two things. One is that it's not true that China was the kind of best performing country during the financial crisis. Keep in mind that the 2008 financial crisis originated in the West, originated in the United States, right? So of course, you're going to have the United States performing worse as compared with China, right? So it's like two persons, one got the flu, and the person who got the flu is going to be bad as compared with another person who got a little bit of the flu. So that's one thing. So it's not surprising. That kind of comparison is not surprising. And I don't think it really sort of changes any fundamental issues and arguments. But the other thing I want to say is that if you look at what India was able to do, India was able to put through the 2008 financial crisis almost without any stimulus program.
That's really interesting.
This is kind of unknown and underrated story. Yes, it didn't achieve like gravity-defying growth as China did, but much of that gravity-defining growth is actually now observing the law of gravity. They are coming down, high debt and all of that.
In China.
In China. So if you look at debt to GDP ratio, China is easily the highest in the country, in the world. Talking about 160%, maybe even higher. India, 60%. They were able to grow, by Indian standard, quite a healthy rate without any stimulus program. I would say that country responded better than China, precisely because that country didn't have the kind of vulnerabilities that you have with state capitalism as compared with China. So I think the 2008 financial crisis, they pumped the money into the system, which helped the private sector and crony capitalism, right? So essentially, because the leadership was in pursuit of GDP, anything goes. That's the mentality. So I would say probably corruption multiplied, governance worsened in exchange for rapid GDP growth. I would argue the accumulation of the corruption is doing far more damage to the long-run Chinese economics and politics than getting a few extra points of GDP growth. And so now we are sort of very into the Xi Jinping era, right? So essentially what Xi Jinping did in 2012 and 2013 since then was tackling this damage by corruption, by crony capitalism, right? Dealing with this massive cancer in the Chinese system. So look at what he has done, right? So he got rid of all these corrupt officials and he cleaned the entire house. So that's one thing he did. And I would say there's some good that comes from, but he has done more. He's using the anti-corruption campaign as a launching ground for political authoritarianism. So essentially, the corruption festered during the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao period, fed into this narrative. We need political centralization to deal with it. Essentially, it sealed the Chinese fate for an authoritarian system. There's a lot of support for Xi Jinping today for his anti-corruption. There's a lot of applause from the Chinese people. And there's a lot of support for him to abolish the two-term limits.
And what's interesting to me about your analysis here is that it's not just that Xi Jinping is able to take the popular support for fighting corruption and do a anti-corruption campaign that gives him greater legitimacy and then pivot from that into also building up his political authority. Yeah. It's not just that, but you use the analogy of cancer, and it seems to me that the campaign within that terms of that analogy can be understood as the surgery part, but the fundamental nature of the economic system that was able to be directed in a way that would lead to corruption, that hasn't changed. So the chemotherapy part, the part that would be fundamentally getting at the root of the illness hasn't been done. They've just cut out the symptoms, the parts that are visible. Yeah. They've cut that out, but as far as I can tell, Xi Jinping, since coming to power in 2012, 2013, has not done anything meaningful to change the state-led capitalism model that has become more and more entrenched since the 1990s.
Yeah. So I agree with what you just said 100%, but I'm going to use a slightly different formulation of the example that you gave. So this is cancer. So Xi Jinping has done surgery and chemotherapy. Yeah, he has done that. What he hasn't done is, now we know from...
Well, maybe my point was he hasn't done the chemotherapy. He's just done the surgery.
No, actually, I disagree with that.
I see.
Right? So in terms of therapy side, right? So if we stick with this analogy, in terms of the therapy side, he has done an aggressive version of surgery and an aggressive version of chemotherapy. We now know from cancer research, cancer, not all the cancers, but many cancers are utterly preventable. So smoking, diet, exercise, all these things. He hasn't done any of those things to prevent the future cancer from happening. He got rid of the current cancers, right? Zhou Yongkang is locked up. Wen Jiabao is locked up. Xu Caihou, these generals.
Wen Jiabao is locked up?
Oh, sorry.
Maybe someday.
Bo Xilai.
Bo Xilai.
Right. So sorry. Yeah.
Wen Jiabao might be in some kind of restrictive space.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, he's not locked up. So, and apology to him. So Bo Xilai, right? But the problem that I see is this requires constant high-pressured therapy, constant chemo, constant surgery. Essentially, the therapy is trying to run ahead of the disease. That, by definition, is not durable. Once you relax, the cancer is going to come back. Once you relax a little bit, the cancer is going to come back. So I applaud the taking on cancer head on, right? I think less cancer is better than more cancer, right? Chemotherapy and all of that. But I will go further, right? I would take care of the diet, play more tennis, run more, bike more, walk to work more, right? Careful about meat and all of that, right?
And to me, that means what you're saying is reducing state involvement in the economy.
That's right. So to do that, you got to give up on or reduce state capitalism. I haven't seen evidence of that. I actually see evidence of that increasing. So if I have to project into the future, I think the cancer is going to come back.
And when you say that it's increasing, what are the things in the first 5 years of Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang's tenure that you see as solidifying state capitalism even further than what it was before?
Well, so whether it's by intention or not, right? Look at these big private enterprises, Anbang, HNA, these guys, they all expanded under the watch of the current leadership in the middle of the anti-corruption campaign. Yesterday at the conference, I presented statistics showing the rising share of limited liability corporations. Many of these are instruments of state capitalism, right?
You said private enterprises.
No. So they are both private enterprises as well as state-backed enterprises that are the instruments of state capitalism, right? They're all rising. And the limited liability corporations, which are a particular kind of instrument, rose especially sharply, right? So, obviously, Xi Jinping's, in economic terms, in political terms, it's 5 years, so it's kind of long. But in economic terms, there are still just 5 data points. So, can I say definitively this is going to be a trend? I don't know. But it's already first term, right? So,
but I think this might be a place to just clarify for listeners, because when we say private enterprise, they might think something that is not connected to state control. But in reality, the kinds of private enterprises that you're discussing now and in your paper do exhibit strong dimensions of state control.
Well, the crony...
How would you distinguish between a more 1980s style town and village enterprise, private enterprise, and Anbang?
Yeah. Well, the big distinction is the access to political power. The head of Anbang married into one of the most powerful political families in the country, and he was able to raise billions and billions of capital, and he was able to do things for a long period of time against the Chinese law. Essentially, he was in insurance business, but he was also investing in high-risk products, and he was able to get the foreign exchange that other companies were not able to get. And this is because he has this political network. So the company itself is private owned. There's no question about it, right? But for a private enterprise to be able to do certain things, you need the government permission to do those things. You need the banking system to provide the resources to do those things. how else could he acquire Waldorf Astoria Hotel on the basis of insurance products that he was selling? Absolutely no way, right? He was able to do that because he was able to take out a massive loan from a state-owned banking system that other less connected entrepreneurs couldn't, right? It's not because he's especially smart. Maybe he is, but it's definitely not because of that. It's really because of access to power. So in the last 5 years, many of these enterprises have developed extremely fast. So how does that say about the future of corruption in China? These are kind of, by their very definition, corruption, using the power of the state to advance their own private goals. So crony capitalism has been happening on a massive scale, right? State capitalism has been happening on a massive scale, right? So, and then on the other hand, the leadership is locking up all these people, right? So
there's the political side of the equation.
Well, there's a political side, but I also think that, look, maybe a few of them are innocent, but I think vast majority of them are all crooks. So there's a saying in China that there's so much corruption, so if you line up all the officials against the wall, if you arrest all of them, you arrest too many. But if you arrest, every second one or whatever, so one, how do you arrest the second one, the fourth one, the sixth one, you arrest too few, right? So 50% is too few, 100% is too many. That would say 75% of them are corrupt, right? So yeah, it's a massively corrupt system. And so many of them, arrested by Xi Jinping are absolutely corrupt. So maybe there's a political purpose. So I don't quite agree with this view. It's just politics. Yes, maybe the motivation is, but the effect is they did go after the corrupt officials.
Well, if the overall policy prescription would be to move away from state-led capitalism in order to generate better economic results, not just at the level of GDP, but for individuals and households in China. And if we're looking for any signals that the Chinese government might move in that direction, to move in more market-oriented direction, is it possible that this rhetoric about international trade and opening of markets that Xi Jinping has been articulating, especially lately at the Boao Forum and in other speeches, is it possible that could be, if that's genuine, and if there is genuinely greater openness to foreign investment and reducing various sorts of barriers, is that something that could move the needle back in a direction away from state-led capitalism? Yeah,
so this is a very interesting issue, right? So the current hot issue is the trade war between China and the United States, instigated by Trump. I'm not a super big fan of Trump. On the trade war, I can think of lots of arguments against it. And, today's conference, people talked about how idiotic it is. But I don't think this is Trump's motivation. I don't think he understands any of this. But I think the net effect of the trade war on China is a positive one. It pushes the Chinese leadership to make a decision about opening or closing. They have never faced this kind of pressure and deadline as they are faced now, right?
Which is Trump saying you have to open up your markets, you have to roll back government intervention in the economy, you have to make it more fair for our companies to do business in China, to sell our goods in China. Otherwise, we're going to impose $150 billion in tariffs on your imports.
And you have to open up.
Or your exports.
You have to open up the financial sector. You have to open up the technology sector, right? And I think China has moved. So in the 1990s, one saving grace was China embraced globalization. I will quarrel with the method with which they did that, but still, globalization is globalization. The country, since this is actually during the Hu Jintao period, the middle of his leadership, the country was moving away from that. And now the Trump shock is prompting the discussions in China. It is really to reverse the reversal, right? To reverse this slide further away from globalization. So I think this is, from the Chinese side, I would argue, the trade war has been a good sort of anchoring thing that forces the leadership to make a decision. It's not just the trade war, it's also the Republican tax cut, which I think is fundamentally damaging to the United States. But it does prompt the discussion in China about taxes, right? Tax rates. China has very high tax rates on foreign companies and domestic companies. So I would say these are sort of unintended side benefits of Trump shocks. And, we can have a debate whether or not, if Hillary won the electoral college vote, whether or not the same thing will happen. Probably similar things will happen. But, hey, these things happen under Trump. We got to give him some credit, right? So I'm sort of mildly sympathetic with the idea of using these external pressure points to prompt China to move forward. And the reason is fundamentally, we have no other means. Before, you had some internal freedom of discussion, you had differences of the points of views within. All of that is gone. Right?
And before you had transitions in leadership. I mean, one
now
of the
you don't have that,
points
right?
in our discussion so far has been that whatever was the approach taken in the Jiang Zemin years, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, they did have some differences that they were able to, at least on the poverty, the rural crisis alleviation front. But now you don't have necessarily that prospect of a transition going forward. So I take your point that if there's something that's going to prompt a change, it might have to be exogenous.
It has to be. So essentially, some of the actions that the Chinese leadership itself has taken is forcing the rest of the world to confront China directly. Because in the past, actually I heard this directly from Chinese officials. Oh, let's just wait 2 years, because the leadership will be gone by then, Oh, I know this guy who is going to be prominent in the next administration, he's going to take care of all these problems. Now, how do we do that, right? So I think what has happened in China, abolishing the two-term limit, is going to provoke more of the backlash against China, not against the abolition per se, although there is some of that, but the backlash is going to be, we have no other mechanisms, right? That's the only way.
And it's not just that there isn't otherwise a source of backlash, but I think it's worth noting that this China model that we've been using that term to reference the state-led capitalism, the Chinese leadership has in some ways become increasingly confident about their conception of it. And rhetorically have been projecting this even as a model for other countries to study. In the 19th Party Congress, in his work report, Xi Jinping explicitly said that, our model of state-led capitalism provides a new trail for other developing countries to achieve modernization, for countries who want to preserve their independence vis-a-vis the Western consensus, and offers, a Chinese wisdom to solving their problems. So there is a confidence about their system. You wouldn't even just be like, oh, we might have some doubts about this. This is a deep held confidence in this and projecting it abroad. So the only potential way to push back on that would be some kind of exogenous shock, like provoked by this trade war.
So I think that's another sort of, I would say, self-inflicted damage, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, no, I believe it's a mistaken belief, but let's pretend that it is not. It's one thing to say, okay, our model has worked for us, but it's really up to others to decide what their model should be. It's one thing to say that, and quite another to say, take our model, and by the way, we have all this money to make you do that, right?
Well, now you're talking about the Belt and Road project.
That's right. And I don't think that approach is going to be greeted very kindly, right? And because there is a sort of a post-Bretton Woods consensus which says governance matters, corruption is bad, and we need to pay attention to institutions and rule of law and all of that. Is it a lot of empty rhetoric? Maybe it is, but I think there is some substance to it, right? Now you have a disruptor, right, coming in with lots of money. And by the way, the money should really be rightfully in the pockets of the Chinese people rather than in the hands of one government. And one reason why China is so powerful is because one government is able to possess all these resources that should belong to the Chinese people, right? So that's a sort of a technical discussion, but it's actually important to clarify.
Well, it's important for emphasizing that when you say China is a wealthy country, what exactly
it's
is
not a wealthy country. It's actually a poor country. It's the middle income country. And China, yes, has this huge foreign exchange reserves, but it's really not the government that has the foreign exchange reserve. Government is the custodian of the money, right, rather than the owner of the money, right? So many people don't quite understand that. They think foreign exchange reserves are owned by the government. No, these are the claims that ordinary Chinese and enterprises have on this resource. And the Chinese government is owing to them the liability of this resource, right? So many people don't quite understand that. They think it's because this is not tax money. Foreign exchange reserve is accumulated not through taxation program, but through a legal requirement that you convert your foreign exchange earnings into RMB. That's right. So you get RMB from the government, you turn in the foreign exchange reserve. Technically speaking, I always have the right to convert it back. Essentially, you are the temporary custodian of my dollars because I have the equivalent amount of the RMB to claim back that money, right? So that's the money they are using. And in a free market economic system, suppose I believe you're misusing that money, I have the right to get it back. And if you're really misusing that money, you won't generate returns. You may even lose the principal. When I want to get it back, I may not be able to get it back, right? That's a definition of currency crisis, right? That means that your currency has to depreciate, right? So the Chinese government is using this money as if they own the money. It doesn't. It doesn't.
Well, it sounds as if this potential trade war is one of the only avenues that you can foresee at the moment provoking some of these needed changes. And so we're recording this conversation at the end of April when Steve Mnuchin has just gone to China to negotiate with his counterpart, Liu He, the top Chinese economic official. And we'll have to see how those negotiations play out. When this episode appears, who knows at that point what the nature of the economic relationship will be. But could you just close by maybe pointing out a few things that should be markers for us to look for in terms of the economic relationship between the US and China and how that might provoke or not provoke change?
So in the short run, I think the things we should be looking for are some sort of announcement of implementation schedule. We have heard a lot of rhetoric and pronouncement about broad reforms, this and that, number of times. What's lacking is a schedule. What's lacking is actual action. In reality, even those things may not be enough because there are so many. So this is the one complexity of dealing with China. The government has so many tools, right? They can use this, they can use that. They give up on this tool, but they really use other tools to counteract. right? So I think a whole system approach would be better, right? And really fundamentally reducing state capitalism and institutional reforms and rule of law. Yeah, but these are pipe dreams, and they may not be quick actions that can happen. So, but in the short run, I would say a timetable, specific actions, and more transparency, right? And some evidence of soul searching, right? Some discussions of, oh, maybe we haven't handled this right. Maybe we could have done better, right? I would actually see if there are more reflections along that line and more freedom on the part of the people who could reflect more. If we see those in the next 2 months, then I will feel a bit more optimistic. If we don't, I think the trade war is going to get worse.
Well, let's hope that when this episode appears, that some of the positive things that you're hoping for will have materialized. We'll have to keep our eye on it. But in any case, this was such a great, fun conversation. I think it was so illustrative of your depth of knowledge. We went down a lot of different areas, and I just learned so much. It was such a pleasure to listen to you. So thank you so much, Yasheng Huang 老师. Thank you so much for your insight and really deep knowledge that you conveyed in this episode today.
Yeah, thank you. This is a lot of fun. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And otherwise, I hope listeners will stay tuned for the next episode of the podcast, featuring yet another participant from our annual conference, Professor Victor Shi of University of California, San Diego. In the meantime, please do continue to follow and support the podcast. Keep staying tuned for more cutting-edge analysis like today's, courtesy of the Penn Center for the Study of Contemporary China. And thank you, as always, for listening.
Thank you.